Hey, this is Sky. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I want to talk about masculinity again. It's just kind of an odd topic in some ways when I think about it because I don't really remember philosophizing on masculinity 25 years ago when I was younger, when I was a younger man. I never really had conversations with other guys about ways to be masculine or ways that we can recapture masculinity because we felt like it was being taken or it was somehow slipping away from us. We never talked about society going downhill. We're talking about it now, though, so I started to think about it. And I do realize that there is a decline in masculinity. The American male is starting to transform into something else, that's something that I don't really feel familiar with or comfortable with. We're losing a brand of masculinity that I like. A type of masculinity that was found in the 30s, 40s, 50s, early 60s. It started to change in the late 60s. See, my grandparents' generation, the World War II generation, they were the first generation to really take a step away from the traditional masculinity roles. But it didn't start to happen until the late 50s, early 60s. So they would have been out of World War II, settled down with their families and careers, well into adulthood, mid 40s, whatever. That's the greatest generation. And we started to see with them a step towards, let me say it the other way. We started to see a step away from masculinity in subtle ways, real subtly. So men may have looked like men and talked like men and acted like men. We had out of that generation, John Wayne and people like that. But at home, there was a step away from the traditional patriarchal hierarchy of family structure that we had seen for generations upon generations, where the man was the king. Men became slightly more emasculated. Women became more outspoken and had jobs and were earners and became smarter. And this is a good thing. I'm not trying to sound like a misogynist, but I am identifying ways that traditional roles of masculinity kind of subtly slipped away with the greatest generation. But it was really subtle, just little things. And I think a lot of it was in the family structure. We started to see what we might consider to be the birth, the first signs of the weak emasculated male that may come later from later generations. That's where it started. So then when we get down to the baby boomers, my parents' generation, they call them the baby boomers because the greatest generation, the World War II people, they came home from World War II, and during the 1950s, they fucked like rabbits. They all had good jobs and life was great in America for most people. And they had a hell of a lot of kids. The baby boomer generation was born. There's 100 million of them. I think just under 100 million. It's the largest generation we had seen up until the millennials, but we'll get to them in a minute. So then we had a fairly traditional ride with masculinity until we had this drop off with the baby boomers. A lot of what we are seeing today with younger generations, with Gen Z, millennials, maybe even some of the younger Gen X, started, I think, really with the baby boomers. I mean, it was just a whirlwind of change. And that era there was a lot of change at that time with civil rights and women's rights, and social justice was becoming a big deal people became so emotional. The baby boomers are the most emotionally sensitive generation, and you can look that up. That's a statistic. We might think, because a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, no, it's got to be Gen Z or the millennials. It's not. The baby boomers were. They're the biggest crybabies. The ones that stomp on their feet the most. They're the Karens that you guys are all talking about. I didn't even know what that word meant. I had to look it up. Someone was using it the other day. I was just like, Karen, who's that? And he's like, you don't know what a Karen is? So I had to look it up. Thank God for Urban Dictionary. But that's all the baby boomer generation. The hippies took masculinity, traditional gender roles, all that, threw it out the window. First ones to have long hair, right? Name another generation that had long hair. Did my grandparents' generation, did the World War II generation have long hair? Did you see long-haired guys back then? I mean, who? They all had short hair. We saw this overly emotional attachment to our emotions in a way that we hadn't really seen before. The baby boomers were literally screaming and yelling in the streets. They didn't want to do traditional things. They didn't want to have families in a traditional way. They didn't want to have jobs in a traditional way or at all. Wanted to, instead of, like for them, the American dream wasn't so much to be like Leave It to Beaver and get a house in the suburbs and you have your 2 kids and kind of live this Homer Simpson lifestyle, that's, or Family Guy, that's kind of like what we think of the American dream, married with children, that kind of thing. No, they wanted to go live on school buses and travel around the country like gypsies and live in communes. Change America into a communist socialist utopia. And that was some of it. But masculinity really went down in a multifaceted way with the baby boomers, emotionally, physically. And then my generation, we took some of that and ran with it. We had hippies in my generation, deadheads, and they were the same as my parents' generation. Bunch of long-haired dudes. The ones in my generation, you'd see them with long hair and wearing skirts, sandals, and Birkenstocks, wearing women's shirts, looking like total fairies. And they wouldn't be. That would be the funny thing. A lot of those guys are totally straight with beautiful girlfriends, but they dress that way as some kind of statement to smash down traditional masculinity and gender roles, patriarchy, and all that. And you started to see women, families that were centered around women as the head of the family instead of the man. That was it's kind of odd for Western European culture because we're patriarchal, at least have been for thousands of years. And I think my generation really displayed an emotional weakness. My generation kind of took masculinity, any remaining masculinity that might have been still left in the baby boomers, because not all of them were hippies. There was still tradition in the baby boomer generation that was carried from the greatest generation. Not everybody were sheep. But when it got to my generation, each time it's like going through a strainer, and each time you're losing a little bit of material. And my generation, we had all of it. We had glam metal. Took a good, clean, fun, heavy metal and created a genre of it full of makeup and hair. Go look at pictures of Poison. There's a whole bunch of these different bands, and they all dressed like women. Poison, when they came out, people didn't know. Some guys didn't know. They'd be like, yo, did you see those chicks? Like, those aren't chicks, dude. Those are guys. You could stare at that album cover all day and just be like, no, that can't be. But I think that since my generation was largely fatherless, not all, there's lots of people that I know that have fathers, but was a trend with my generation of fatherless families. That wasn't so much of a big thing with my parents' generation. The baby boomers may have disliked their parents, their Archie Bunker dad. Oh, don't like you, dad. I want to grow long hair and play rock and roll. And that's what they did, right? At least they had a dad. My generation, we grew up without dads. There's thousands of us out in the streets without dads, without male role models, without masculinity in our lives. The mother can't teach you masculinity, no matter how much she wants to, no matter how tough your mom is. You think your mom's real tough. She's not a guy. You need a dude to teach you how to be a dude. And a lot of people in my generation ended up emotionally weak, little babies, with all kinds of mental illness and problems that maybe could have been avoided if we had some of the masculinity, some of the training. And then when we finally get to the millennials, who we like to pick on so much, or the Gen Z, or loop both of them in the same just for time constraints, they definitely appear to be awfully weak, awfully feminine. There definitely seems to be a problem with masculinity with the younger people. Feels like a problem. Me and my friends talk about this stuff, and you can find intellectuals talking about this online, Jordan Peterson and many others. So you're not new to this conversation, but when you look at it in a context of history, of how we've lost a little bit with each generation, you can understand why these young cats are the way they are. They're really just taking the baton from us and running with it. So to end this off on a positive note, rather than just complaining, because we've identified a problem, what do? Be an example. Be an example of masculinity so some young dude can say, that's a cool motherfucker, I want to be like him. Be someone's role model. Go mentor someone. Smack that feminine shit out of their hand and be like, guys don't do that. You're teaching valuable lessons because they're going to teach that same lesson to their kids someday. We can save the American male. We got to actually put in the work to do it. You can't just bitch about it. Thanks for watching.